Hey guys, welcome to Conrad Craft Music. I'm Conrad Craft, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about music theory terminology. I want to give you a little crash course in some theory terms because theory is one of those things that is ambiguous to a lot of musicians, and it really shouldn't be. A lot of people are a little bit afraid of theory and the terminology that get passed around because theory terminology is kind of complex or fancy sounding. Some of it's even in different languages. Well, we're going to crack a few of these terms for you and help you understand why we use these terms the way we do and why they're so important to understand as a musician trying to communicate to other musicians. See, music theory isn't really an element of music. Music theory is a way to describe the elements of music. Since descriptions can vary across demographic areas, they can vary across continents and countries and people groups, every culture could think about music in different ways. It's called music theory because of those different ways of explaining it. So a way to think about music theory for you in the future might just to be that music theory is simply the way music can be described and understood by the most people. That may change in the future. We may find new ways to describe these elements of music. But for now, these are the terms you're going to see me use most often in these videos. Music theory terminology is the biggest part of music theory, and so there's lots of stuff to learn. This is just going to be step one. We're going to start things from the ground up because I believe it's really important to have a foundational understanding of these concepts and terms. So, we're going to start with the note. What is the note? What does it actually represent? Well, a note can be any of three things or all of these things at the same time. It can be a pitch, which means it's a frequency that's either high or low. It can be an alphabet letter name from our musical alphabet, like A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, or any of the sharps of those alphabet letter names. Or it can be a rhythmic value or an amount of timing in music, like an eighth note, quarter note, half note, and so on. Each one of those elements is a characteristic of a note in music. You can talk about them outside of music, and so when you do that, you're generally talking about one of those things. Like I could talk about a rhythm and only talk about eighth notes and not mention the note alphabet letter name or mention its frequency, like is it a high A or is it a low A. I could ignore all of that stuff and just talk about its rhythmic value. And inside of music, though, you can't really take things in that way because they're all of those things at the same time. So that's basically where a note begins, and things are built from notes, so I thought that'd be a good place to start. Now, because notes are frequencies and frequencies are waves of sound, those waves have like hills and valleys, okay? That's what the frequency is determined by, how many of those it has in a certain amount of space or a certain amount of time. And that is actually what determines the pitch of the note. So if you have a lot of those hills and valleys of a frequency, the note is going to be really high pitched, okay? And if the valleys and hills and valleys are really far apart, they're really big, that's going to be lower pitches, lower frequencies. When we number those hills and valleys in that set amount of time, that's where we get the determination of hertz for each of those notes. And so if you look at a tuner on a guitar, a lot of times you'll see the number 440 and the symbol for hertz beside it, or just 440. And what it's describing in those numbers is a frequency for the note A. 440 hertz is a frequency most commonly used to determine what A is. And if you multiply that frequency times 2, you go to 880, you've doubled the speed of the wave. That means that the frequency has jumped an octave. So every time you double a frequency, you jump an octave in music. So you go from a middle A, like at 440, to a higher A at 880, and then to an even higher A when you double that. And then if you were to start at 440 and go lower, you would just divide it in half instead of multiplying by 2. So that would look like 220 instead of 440, right? 440 divided in half is 220. That's a lower A. Or 110 is even lower A, right? And you could keep going and dividing things in half until you're in crazy weird fractions of wavelengths
for that given amount of time. But that's what frequencies, i.e. pitches, are. And because we have these wavelengths that reach a point where they double, we have a set amount of sounds that we can make before we reach that double over place. So you can only go, say, between 220 hertz and 440 hertz, those two different kinds of A notes. You can only go so many sounds from the 220 before you run into the 440, which is a repeat or an octave jump of the 220 sounds. That is why we only have a certain number of notes in the musical alphabet. The musical alphabet only goes from A to G, and there are sharps and there are flats between some of those, right? That's because, like, we didn't go all the way through, you know, we don't have 18 musical alphabet notes. We don't have 20 musical alphabet notes. And that's because each of these frequency changes creates a sound change. And each one of those sound changes that gets measured has to be measurably understandable to the human ear. Even if we can measure them mathematically, it doesn't matter if we can't hear the change. So when you divide up those frequencies into changes that we can hear, that's where we get the smallest steps in music, called half steps or semitones. We also call these chromaticisms. Okay, all of these words, half steps, semitones, chromaticisms, these are all the smallest distances you can move in music and still recognize that a change has occurred. Like if I'm playing a note A at 440 hertz, and then I change it from 440 to 445, your ear can't detect that. So it's not really a different note to our ear. But as soon as you can detect a change, that's when we start measuring. And it's these detectable changes that create the spectrum of the musical sounds that we use in Western music. So that spectrum is called the chromatic scale. Okay, so what that is it's borrowing a term used in light description or description of sunlight, of different kinds of light. It means, in those terms, it means light which contains all of the colors. Chroma light is light which has all the colors of the rainbow in it. When you see a rainbow, you're seeing those colors split apart from each other. But normal white light has all the colors. So a chromatic scale, obviously, is therefore a scale that has all the notes, all of the different divisions that we can make between sounds. And there are 12 of these, 12 semitones, 12 half steps. Now you don't have to just use half steps, obviously. We use a lot of different kinds of steps or distances in music, and we jump from one distance to another distance, and we create these things called scales. But when one musician is describing these distances to another musician, they will generally use the terms half step and the term whole step. Now a whole step is just exactly what it sounds like. It's twice the distance of a half step. So let's say, for instance, I'm on a guitar and I'm playing some lead on a guitar, and I'm trying to describe to another guitar player where I'm moving from one note to another. And I could say something like, oh, I'm 2 whole steps up, or I'm a whole step and a half step up from where I last was. So that distance on a guitar is measured by the frets on that instrument. So any fretted instrument works this way. Every single fret is a half step distance away from the previous fret, below it or above it. So if I'm on fret 5 on a guitar or a mandolin or a banjo or anything like that, and I go up 1 fret to fret 6, that's a half step move. If I go down to fret 4, that's also a half step move. If I want to go a whole step move on that instrument, I would go from fret 5 to fret 7, or from fret 5 down to fret 3. Those are whole step moves. And you can compound these things on top of each other. I could go 2.5 steps up from fret 5, right? So you just jump from 5 to 7 to 9. That would be 2 steps, and then a half step higher would be fret 10. So these are distance descriptions that musicians can use to communicate what they're doing on their instrument or what they're doing in the scale to each other. On a piano, for instance, if you were on a white key like C, a half step distance would be from C up to the very next black key on that keyboard. That very next black key would be called C sharp. So that's a half step distance. And the word sharp or flat, those are commands. They're not notes. They're commands to move either up or down. To sharp a note is to move up a half step. To flat a note is to move down a half step. It doesn't matter what note you're on, you're being told to move from a note to a position. So if I wanted to start at note C and sharp it, I would go from C to C sharp. If I wanted to sharp it twice, that would be moving up 2 half steps, or what we call a whole step. So from C up to C sharp is 1 half step, and then from C sharp up to D is another half step. So that would be a double sharped C, if that makes sense. The word sharp is a command. It tells you to move up a half step. The word flat is a command. It tells you to move down. And if you double it, triple it, quadruple it, whatever, you're just still moving up. It's still a command. So a whole step on a piano would be like from C to D instead of C to C sharp. And if you want to go 2 whole steps, you would go C up past the C sharp to D, up past the D sharp to E. And so these terms, half step and whole step, these are going to be the most used terms between musicians when describing moving from one place to another place, generally. And they're the most universal terms across instruments. And that's why they're so popular, is because it doesn't matter what you play, you can use these terms, and other musicians should understand them. So everything up to this point has described kind of the total gambit of what a note is, and how many of them there are, and how they work together, how far apart they are from each other. So when we start isolating that whole spectrum down to a few choices, we start creating what are called scales. And right now I'm just talking about the tonal choices. I'm not talking about rhythmic notes really, and I'm not going to talk about frequencies much anymore. Now we're just talking about the letters A through G in the musical alphabet and the sharps and flats that go along with that. Okay, so what is a scale? Well, the word scale literally means to climb. And we have all these notes that go from a low sound to the same sound but higher up in what we call the octave. Okay, and let's define that term real quick, just because I don't think I've done it yet. An octave is what you get when you've gone through all 7 of the musical alphabet letters, and you have to repeat the first alphabetical letter at the top of the order, creating an 8th note, which is the repeat. That's why it's called an octave. The word octa meaning 8 notes. That's what an octave is. So if you jump 8 alphabet letters, 8 musical notes, you've jumped an octave. A scale is simply an organization of steps that goes from that first note to the repeat at the octave. Those steps could be any combination of whole steps and half steps. It could be all half steps or all whole steps. It could be a very symmetrical pattern like whole, whole, half, you know, something like that. And the distances could actually be larger than whole steps or half steps as well. You could have a 1.5 step jump in a scale, and there are scales that do have them. But the scale that I want to really define for you right now is going to be the scale that's most used. And the most used scale is the major scale, or the diatonic scale. This scale is kind of the grandfather of all scales and all chords and modes and major parts of theory terminology that you will hear spoken by other musicians. It's kind of ground zero. This is the place that it all starts. And you modify this scale, or the way to think about getting other scales often is modifying this scale. So let's define what this scale is. If you start at a note, let's say, make it easy, let's start at A. We have these 12 semitones divided into 7 natural tones, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and the sharps that go along with them. If we arrange these notes so that they have the most consonant sounds with each other, that's when we actually automatically start creating what's called the major scale or diatonic scale. Years and years ago, people kept arranging the distances they were using in the octave in different ways until they realized that there was this one scale that no matter what they did in it seemed to have pleasant harmonies and pleasant just coordination between all of the notes. That consonance gave it its popularity, and its usability comes out of those consonant relationships. So there's a simple formula to create this diatonic or major scale, and the formula uses the half step and whole step terms that we just defined. So let's learn this scale. You start at a note, any note, and you go up a whole step, and a whole step, and then a half step. Then you go up a whole step, whole step, whole step, and then a half step. So from the starting note, we go whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That's a starting note, 2 whole steps, and then a half step. Then 3 whole steps and a half step. So in between those steps, that's where the notes are landing. Starting note, whole step, next note. Whole step, next note. Half step, next note. And we can actually number each of those stopping positions between those jumps. So starting note would be number 1. From 1 to 2, we have a whole step. From 2 to 3, we have a whole step. From 3 to 4, we have a half step. From 4 to 5 is a whole. 5 to 6 is a whole. 6 to 7 is a whole. And then from 7 to the octave 8, we have a half step. So this pattern has been memorized for years by school kids, by musicians, by anybody learning about music theory in this way. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or some people have put words to those first letters of the word whole and half, put different words to it, such as, or to create a mnemonic device, such as we walk home when we walk home. And whatever works for you really is what you should do there. But the pattern whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step is the pattern that will create a major scale for you no matter what note you start on in the whole spectrum of notes. That pattern sounds like the do re mi scale. Do re mi fa sol la ti do, do ti la so fa mi re do. That set of notes is what we call the major scale. We actually build almost all of the chords used in popular music from that scale. And so this scale is going to be the most versatile, most used, most important scale for you to start understanding. When you hear someone say the words do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and do, those words actually have a name. That's called solfege. And solfege is just an arrangement of words that assign identities to the positions inside of the scale. So the first position is do, the second position is re, the third position is mi, fourth position is fa, the fifth position is sol, the sixth position is la, seventh position is ti, and the octave is back to do. So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do is a way of creating a map of the positions of the scale so that specifically vocalists can talk to each other because they don't have an instrument to show each other. They can talk to each other about where these notes are in the scale that they're singing. So vocalists have these tools at their disposal to communicate to each other, and non-vocalists can use them too, and they're really handy mental tools because you know, there's no reason you shouldn't also be thinking in these terms. You shouldn't just be making your fingers know what these different positions are. Your brain should have names for these things, and so using the terms, using the words that a vocalist would use can be really handy. It also helps with ear training tremendously. If you're trying to learn songs, being able to recognize and name the positions in the scale when you hear them, that helps you translate them into, okay, now where do I go with my finger to play that note in the scale on this instrument? So I highly recommend getting very familiar with solfege terms and start using solfege when you're singing. You could sing simple children's story songs such as Three Blind Mice in solfege, and it would help you understand the positions of the scale being used. As a quick example, that would sound like mi, re, do, so, fa, mi, so, fa, mi. And that would be where you could just continue through the song identifying what note you're on by the solfege position and saying those things. It reinforces the mental concept of what a scale is and how far these distances of the notes are apart from each other. It reinforces that so well. It's hard to overstate how helpful it is. So just to sum up, we've started with what a note is, and we're all the way to a major scale and how to make it, how to describe it, some language terms like solfege that are used to describe it vocally without an instrument. If you didn't understand any of this stuff, please let me know down below. I want to improve these videos and I want to be as clear as possible.
I hope this video was helpful to you. If you liked it, please go ahead and leave me a thumbs up. And if you enjoyed this kind of video, leave a comment and tell me what else you'd like to learn about in the future. And until next time, I'll see you in the studio.